seconds and I'm hooked up to a hard wire. See how long it'll take here. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. They're like, okay, yeah, 20 minutes, and all of a sudden it just stops and increases to like 50 minutes. At this point, it's 9, 10. I'm like, well, that's just not going to make it.
Yeah, I never know when it does that. Like, should I just hope it's lying or restart it real quick or find a different?
I hoped it was lying until about 9:30, and I was like, yeah, I gotta check something. So I started with our FTP, then I went to a B transfer, and then I went back to the original format,
Yeah.
and that worked.
I always want to do week transfer, but then I feel like it's taking up some kind of, I don't know, downloading speed or uploading speed or something. So
I think B transfer is slower.
really,
Then at least the direct to the station connection that I get, it's a little bit slow, by like a few minutes. It's like not that much. Like it'll take 5 minutes to export rather than 3.5, but still.
yeah, they claim there's a direct to the station and published in the UPS for us, but it never works outside of the station.
I had to like do like a workaround because our system would see that the file was coming in and be like, there's a file, I'm gonna encode this and put this into the show. It was grabbing it too quickly. It was just grabbing like half of the file and it's like, yeah, we're good. So like half the package, it happened like 3 times, like half of the plate was like, done, no more. It was fun referral.
Yeah.
I'm tired.
Did you get any sleep?
I haven't been home, or I haven't left here.
What?
Did you fall asleep anywhere here?
No, I've been actually doing work, and I did take a little nap in the office, but it's done.
Thanks for your hard work.
Pays the bills.
You're gonna be off on Monday? Maybe we're working for the 3 days.
I work for myself.
Well, you could be off.
There'll be ice cream waiting for you. Have you been to the station yet?
Oh, I went to go grab a car and I didn't see one. Yeah, I missed that guy.
You did. Did you go to the drive-thru in front?
Nuh-uh.
That's what you do. You go to the front and stop. Person runs,
Calm
walk
down.
out.
What you saying?
I was getting ready to.
Is that what you said?
An ice cream drive through today.
What does that mean? A drive? They walk it out or?
Our GM said, hey, today we're going to do ice cream, but you got to drive up to it because some of us are in the garage or whatever. So we drive to the front of the building and come out with ice cream. Is that sweet?
I'll have to go get
It's
some.
good. Alright, have some. It's the little things.
Yeah.
And it was just not a lot of fun. I mean, the problem was there's just too much not good information out there.
Yeah. Was there a sense when they extended it to 8 o'clock that they would take it to 8 o'clock?
Then what?
When they extended the deadline to 8 in the morning, that everyone figured they could probably go right up to 8 in the morning?
I figured they'd work till they got it done.
Yeah.
Whether that was noon or 8 o'clock, or they were still meeting.
Could they have extended it again? I mean, they could.
I don't really even know the rules. I was just, like I said, I was too busy trying to understand what the bill did, let alone worry about the rules to get me there or us there. No, I've been here since 8 o'clock yesterday morning.
Are you gonna get in your car and drive back?
No, I didn't drive back.
But I mean, when you're done today.
I'll be fine.
Please be careful.
Do you read goals?
I'll be fine.
Yeah.
What did they ask you about
Camera.
sleep deprivation and taxes? Talking about
I can
see me talking about
I could make a crass comment, but I'll make it privately.
Okay.
That's more really what I'm quite honestly a little bit more worried about. The next big cluster is gonna be his building. It surprised me. 200 plus people all packed together, many of them all sit next to one another. And I mean, I had a lot of very close conversations. I mean,
I recall specifically when we were in the Supreme Court chambers, there was someone there, they were like, oh, lawmakers who weren't on it, but were just sitting and watching.
60-40 none.
Oh, yeah, oh, you're like, oh, are you looking at
You were in the Senate.
literally touching each other in rooms, and it smells like, okay,
Yeah, I heard someone even stop downstairs to get their temperature taken.
I heard.
And I was just walking up with my,
You talking to me?
and then I had someone tell me,
You know, you don't have to wear it.
I don't know, I have one.
Public private, I don't have to do it.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know really how to this. I mean, I'm aware of it, but I don't know how much
You
pain
should
I
have been
put
like,
in it.
no way, really?
Probably doesn't do much.
I really believe that the best thing it does is prevent you from subconsciously touching your mouth and nose. Because
That's,
that
it does.
right.
Although I do tend to play with it more because it sometimes annoys me.
Yeah, but that's still that's still a layer of protection that you going.
Well, no, that it is.
I tried, at least that, I guess, I said, it's so much thing.
It's important to say.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I'd say it's maybe 60-40, but that's a very loose.
Yeah.
I mean, after a while you take it off too, because you have to talk to people and it's just getting, it's just kind of annoying after a while. I just want to go home.
I saw that Jim McLean took a photo at the end that they did in Health Barcelona. One of the lawmakers kind of looked exhausted in his seat with his mask hanging from one ear, hanging out.
Here we go.
At some point,
Very
you know,
good.
just us to say that they're just like, screw it, we're just gonna.
I was here once till 6 in the morning, back in 2011. And I thought that was unusual.
Were you there in 2015? Wasn't that?
I was not here in 2015.
So, Brad, I meant to ask you, when was the last time you pulled an all-nighter?
When I was here in 2011,
Is that it?
it was 6 in the morning, not 8.
Exactly. All right.
It's been a long couple days.
Okay. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. I'll say first that I've not had much time yet to reflect on the spectacle that transpired on the third floor of the Kansas State Capitol last night and this morning. And just like the entire Kansas legislature, I also haven't had an opportunity to read or review the complex and consequential legislation they passed in the middle of the night. Therefore, I will confirm up front that I have no intentions of announcing my plans for specific bill signatures or vetoes this afternoon. But I do think all that transpired yesterday, overnight, and this morning can be encapsulated in a single question raised by one lawmaker on the floor of the Kansas House of Representatives just moments before the chamber voted on legislation to dramatically weaken Kansas's ability to fight COVID-19. A disease which, may I remind you, has infected nearly 9,000 Kansans, a disease that has sent over 780 of our moms and dads, grandparents, friends, colleagues, and neighbors to the hospital, a disease that has tragically killed 185 of our fellow Kansans, and has become the leading cause of death in the United States in a matter of weeks, a disease for which there is no cure. Mr. Speaker, the legislator said, pausing his comments about this public policy that could mean life or death for Kansans across the state, could I ask that we not throw paper airplanes in the chamber during debate on important legislation? I wish that had been a joke. I wish it had been some sort of metaphor. I also wish that this had not been the most embarrassing, irresponsible display of governing that we have witnessed throughout this ordeal. But unfortunately, what happened in the Kansas legislature yesterday was simply indefensible from start to finish, and there is no way for me to sugarcoat that for the people of Kansas. I don't say these things lightly. Until I became governor, serving as a member of the Kansas Senate was the honor of a lifetime. It is an awesome responsibility and opportunity. The Kansas legislature is empowered to solve problems. The votes cast have the potential to set the trajectory for the future of our state. These chambers are designed to serve as a marketplace of ideas. The process is intended to be boisterous, even passionate at times. That said, there should also be no illusions whatsoever that the process is free of flaws. It is a human endeavor, and therefore mistakes are baked into the equation. By nature, the tallying of votes creates winners and losers. This imperfect process has always required that Kansans save room for a bit of grace and patience and forgiveness for their elected leaders when things veer off course. They must not allow missteps to deter their faith and optimism that the people of Kansas will ultimately set things right in one way or another. But this is also why generations of Kansas legislators established rules and protocols to govern themselves as they govern the state. It's why, historically, the Kansas legislature has always honored certain precedents for behavior and abided by certain decorums. Even at the height of tensions in the lawmaking process, a process that is inherently political, there have historically been things that Kansas legislators just don't do to each other or to their constituents. Yesterday, throughout the night and this morning, so many of these time-honored decorums were thrown out the window when they were needed most. Sine Die marks the ceremonial end of the legislative session in Kansas. Most years, it is a time for tying up a few loose ends, cleaning out offices, announcing retirements, and bidding farewell to your colleagues for the year. Of course, 2020 was different in every way, so it was expected that Sine Die could be a bit more robust this year. The legislature had been forced to quickly adjourn its regular session in March when coronavirus turned our world upside down. It was reasonable to anticipate that legislative committees might want to try to finish a few legislative efforts here and there. As a former legislator, I considered that to be a fully reasonable expectation, but that's not what happened here. In the weeks leading up to Sine Die, lobbyists and a small number of Republican legislative leaders crafted a series of self-serving and, frankly, dangerous pieces of legislation behind closed doors and in the offices of special interest groups. When those proposals reached the Senate floor for debate yesterday, the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate President abruptly, unilaterally banned all amendments and public debate, saying that they were basically out of patience with legislators from both sides of the aisle who wanted an opportunity to discuss ask questions, or even read these pieces of legislation. As the day dragged on, bills were bundled together in massive, unwieldy pieces of legislation that spanned multiple unrelated topics. This violated common sense rules that typically limit legislation to 2 policy subjects. I'll acknowledge that this rule has been ignored at other points in recent years, and it's worth noting that it never ended well. The bigger legislation is, the less that it is vetted, and the faster it is passed, culminate in a perfect recipe for unintended consequences. Additionally, Democrats were prematurely removed from conference committee negotiations, completely boxed out of any opportunity to influence or shape any of these policy packages. Entirely new pieces of legislation seemingly appeared from out of thin air, bills that had received no committee or floor discussion during the regular session, violating the expectation that sine die would stay focused on issues that had already been on the radar of the legislature. In some cases, Republican senators were asking on the floor if they would be able to see the text of the bill before they voted on it. And those were just some of the procedural shenanigans that have shocked and stunned so many Kansans. I haven't even touched on the substantive policy problems these bills raise. In addition to the obvious sweeping bill that surfaced at 3 a.m. to limit executive authority during times of emergency, one that jumps to mind is the budget. Prior to yesterday, both chambers announced that they would not run any kind of budget bill as originally planned, despite the fact that Kansas now faces a $1 billion budget shortfall over the next 2 years. I actually did not fault this decision initially until a new appropriations bill appeared out of nowhere late last evening, full of new spending for pet projects instead of the difficult but necessary cuts that we know will be needed to balance the budget once the economic devastation of this pandemic takes full effect. And instead of balancing the state budget Kansas legislators are charged with overseeing, they sought to take control over how to spend federal stimulus dollars. Kansas recently received to help communities recover from COVID-19. After an initial review, legislative efforts to seize control over the CARES Act funding will only add layers of bureaucracy to the process and will create huge delays in getting these funds out and into communities where they're so desperately needed. Kansans are hurting. Kansas businesses need help. This is not the time for additional layers of red tape. And of course, there are also serious constitutional and legal questions about what took place yesterday. The legislature had until midnight to finish its work. The Senate president said on the floor that morning, yesterday morning, quote, "We have been told by all of our attorneys that we have to complete our work by midnight. Anything that anything that we pass after midnight that is litigated could be called unconstitutional because the day ends at midnight." Despite warnings of looming legal battles for the state, they proceeded to work well past midnight, passing 7 pieces of legislation before finally adjourning at 8 a.m. this morning. Whatever questions may exist about the work the legislature did, one thing is clear: they had a deadline and they didn't meet it. It was an unprecedented and outstanding demonstration of the dysfunction of our legislature, unlike anything I saw in my years serving in the state Senate. And of course, there's no way to reflect on what happened in the Kansas legislature yesterday without acknowledging how partisan politics motivated everything that transpired. Legislative leaders made no secret yesterday that their actions were politically motivated. And by the end of the day, we saw once again why this is always poisonous to the process. By the wee hours of the morning, legislators were literally screaming at one another during deliberations. It was truly, as one senator noted, a low point. And the losers of this ordeal will be the people of Kansas. Yesterday was difficult for all of us, and there is certainly enough blame to go around. For all of our differences, I hope I speak for everyone when I say that I think we all wish it would have played out differently. And while the legislature may be adjourned, there are still some steps in the process before we can formally close the books on this challenging session. In the coming days, I will thoroughly review every piece of legislation that comes to my desk. My team and I will carefully consider the pros and cons of each proposal, and I pledge to Kansans and to the Kansas legislature that I will make a determination about each proposal on its merits, not on the political motivations that guided it to my desk. Once I've worked through all the bills now headed to my desk, I will then turn my full attention back to fighting the global public health pandemic that continues to put all Kansans at risk. I will continue to implement the Ad Astra plan to safely reopen the Kansas economy when the data indicates that it is appropriate to do so. I share every legislator's concern that we need to get Kansans back to work as quickly and as safely as possible, and I will make this a top priority. I will continue to engage legislators in our recovery and response efforts. I know there will be some lingering tensions after all that happened yesterday, but we need to put the last 24 hours of gamesmanship behind us and move forward. As temperatures cool, I hope all Kansans will remember what I said a few moments ago, that this has never been and never will be a perfect process. We must not let these tough days diminish our faith in Kansans and in each other. And finally, as we enter the Memorial Day weekend, I want to take just a moment and honor all those who have served and paid the ultimate price. I also want to take a moment and thank all those who are serving now and the family members who support them back home. Thank you, and please be safe this weekend. With that, I'll turn it over to Secretary of Health and Environment, Dr. Lee Norman.
Thank you, Governor. Good afternoon. Our current number of case counts is 8,958, which is an increase of 419 cases since Wednesday. We have 66,362 negatives so far, 185 deaths, as the Governor pointed out, which is an increase in 7 deaths since Wednesday. I would also like to point out that the numbers just released today on the national level have the case fatality rate for Kansas only bettered by 5 states. So we are case fatality rate are performing very well. And I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, but our hospitalization and case fatality and death rate per capita continue to be very favorable. Cluster information, we have 99 clusters, half of which are inactive and half of which are active at this point. They account for 4,560 of the cases and 133 deaths. This mostly will be familiar to you, but to reiterate, corrections, we've had 3 clusters with 971 cases and 6 deaths. Gatherings, 10 clusters, 126 cases and 11 deaths. Group living arrangements, there's now 7 clusters with 68 cases and 2 deaths. Healthcare, 30 clusters, 22 cases, and all those settings are inactive from this perspective. Long-term care, 26 clusters, 632 cases and 104 deaths. Meatpacking is the largest, of course, in terms of the number of cases, 10 clusters, 2,398 cases with 7 deaths. And finally, private industry, 40 clusters, 343 cases and 3 deaths. Mass gatherings. We are headed into the Memorial Day weekend as we enter phase 2. It is important to exercise caution and remain vigilant. We know, for example, that Shawnee County had its highest weekly case count this week. This is a reminder that just because we are entering a new phase of reopening, the virus has not gone away. People need to remain vigilant and manage their own preparedness. We encourage, again, anyone who had symptoms after going to the public areas at Lake Perry between May 2nd and 10th to reach out to their healthcare provider. We're not quite out of the window of incubation time yet. Testing and numbers. Relating to our numbers, we are hearing people say things like, with increased testing, this means we will always have an increasing number of cases. While this is true to a point, the important metric we are looking at is the percent of positivity, which is the graph over my right shoulder. It is important that we continue to see an increase in testing and fewer positive test results, which is exactly what this shows. You'll recall that even just a matter of weeks ago, we were in the 50 to 100, 150, 200 cases test results received today. And you'll notice on the left side there that we're over 3,000 test results being received today, per day, which is important for our response as we hopefully have a quieter period of time now, and then as we predict, if we ramp up in the fall and winter to have the testing capability, I have a good deal of comfort we're there now. The trend line you see in the big blue bar going down is the percentage of positives. So while the cases are out there and we're increasing testing, and of course we'll diagnose more of the positive tests, the percentage of positive is going down, which is a very encouraging sign. And by the way, these are, you may have seen in the press, concerns about the CDC, Florida, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and a couple other states about how they report things. This is the PCR documented positive test for the state of Kansas. It is important that we continue to push on the number of tests and the amount of surveillance testing as well. As we work to reopen, it's important to remember that the virus is still out there. There's still no cure, no vaccine. I hope people will enjoy their holiday weekend. And remember, if you go out for any reason, wear a mask. And again, there's a lot of dispute about masks, but I think what's particularly critical for people to remember is when you're outside without a mask, you don't necessarily control your world. You don't necessarily control who's going to be on the elevator with you and cough or sneeze. It's really important to be able to take control, and one of the ways you do that is with a mask. Finally, I met with our incident command team today, which includes KDHE, all of our preparedness people, KDEM representatives, and the events that Governor Kelly talked about serve as disappointment, I guess I might say. We try to remain separate from political processes. But what I want to do is I want to assure you that with every bit of energy we have, every breath we have, we will depoliticize this process, and we will continue to do the prevention and public health work that we are expected to do, and our energies are not dissipated by this, and hopefully none of these political distractions will get in our way. We are committing to continue to do the job we've been asked to do. That's the end of my comments, Governor.
Okay, and with that, we got some questions?
Secretary Norman, so when do we expect to see, if we see it, a change in the numbers based on the phases of reopening? Like, if we assume that reopening means more spread of COVID-19, how and when will that be reflected in the data?
Yeah, the rate, if I understand your question, Celia, the question is not about the absolute number of cases, because the absolute numbers of cases will only go higher over time. What we are seeing is a decrease in the rate of new cases.
Well, yeah, if that's where we would expect to see it, then, so with the reopening phases,
Oh, yes.
we expect to see an increase in the new cases, and when will that?
Yes, perfect. Yeah, we're always looking 2 weeks in a rearview mirror. So after a new phase opens up, you would expect to see the changes within 14 days, but really mostly within 10 days, or because the majority of cases occur within 4 to 7 days after exposure. So we're always kind of chasing our tail a little bit by about 2 weeks. So what we're doing now with entering phase 2, we would expect to see if let's say people are inattentive to the things they should be doing even during phase 2, and the cases start upticking, we would expect to see that 2 weeks from today.
2 weeks from
Today,
okay.
yeah.
All right.
So did we see when phase 1 has been over 2 weeks, but 2.5 weeks since that first started the reopening, we see a bounce at all from opening?
Yeah, the question is, have we seen a bounce from when we moved out of phase 1 or into phase 1? And the answer is, if you look in a small geographic area, you might see a little bouncing around, but for every one of those, you'll see dips, and that's why we tend to follow a trend line that blurs out those differences from small area to small area. That's why we are very attentive to overall statewide metrics, but not inattentive to the things that go on, for example, in a single, even low-populated county. But those, if you saw much of a jump, you would expect that to be due to a cluster or with an outbreak in a, let's say, a business or an industry.
So a lot of people were worried about reopening the state at all, that it would spike cases. Do you credit anything? Either people are being extra cautious, or maybe the virus just isn't spreading as much as it once was?
I think that people are, the populace is divided. Some people are kind of blasting through it like that they have a lot more freedom. And in reality, a lot of people are being very attentive to that. But time will tell. I mean, I think we're going to also have some good fortune by way of the fact that weather in some spring and summer, I think, will be kind to us. It tends to act that way as a virus. It'll be a balance of, are people still attentive, and other people are going to go kind of crazy and not pay attention. Hopefully people will still continue to be attentive, and that's why we've established the guidelines and the rules, really.
Can you just talk about the decision to change the quarantine guidelines at the meatpacking plants and what played into that?
Yeah, sure. And that was not an easy or automatic decision, because the question that you're asking, Brad, I think is, at a time when the meatpacking plants were being hit hard with new cases, people were home, they were being quarantined for a 14-day period of time, and it was going to essentially stop the plants from functioning. At the same time, I can't remember the date for sure, I think it was April 28th, perhaps, that the president put out the executive order that declared, if you will, the meatpacking plants as part of the food industry, an essential industry. Was already a time when we said, we think that we can work with the engineering modifications in the plants. We can work with the companies, we can work with the local health departments to make some changes that will make it safer. We at the same time had requested a few days earlier, and they showed up at that same time, the CDC and NIOSH, which is essentially an occupational safety and health branch of CDC, to come in, walk the floors with the company representatives and the health department. And so at the same time, these coming together saying, I think that we can make some adjustments. We understand that you can never mitigate risk to zero, but you don't want to have maximum risk. Is there someplace in the middle that we can live with? And that's why the decisions were made such as they were. And I think it was actually, even in retrospect, I think it was work. It was very good, high quality work. We've reviewed the engineering guidelines from NIOSH and the CDC. The companies have been in compliance with it, and we've had excellent case finding and isolation of the known cases, bringing people back that are asymptomatic, screening people and doing medical checks during the day. It's been a very thorough process, and I think it's been very solid.
Would a decision have been different if this had been a different industry, if it had not been beef? I mean, beef has it's a very big business in this state. It's got a fair amount of political clout. If we had been talking some other business, would both of you have looked at it differently? Yeah, that's a political question.
Well,
It's not for the governor.
I think you heard Secretary Norman say just moments ago that they are not involving politics in any of the decision-making, and I can vouch for that. And, quite honestly, Brad, neither do I. We really, as I said before, I have really put on audio and visual blinders so that we can look at these things without responding to political pressure, without responding to the emotions of the day, and just make it based on the science. I also think that it was clear that the CDC guidelines paralleled what we were putting in place there. And in addition to the CDC and the NIOSH engineering process that went on, we also established a non-congregant living situation so that people could be quarantined. If their families were too large, they didn't have any place to be isolated at home. We set that up. So we did it with the safety of those workers in mind. Certainly, like we're doing everything else, we recognize the economic impact of the decisions that we make. So those were both on the table, but politics was not any part of the decision. It really was measuring the metrics and the risk factors.
And if I may add, just because I think it's interesting, and I might even brag just a little bit. You have seen over the last week or so about the White House screening with testing with an Abbott device that has a fairly high incidence of false negatives, right? And we use the Abbott device out in many places throughout the state. We've got dozens of them around the state, but we never have used it as the sole screening in packing plants in southwest Kansas or Lyon County. We always followed it up with a PCR test if it was negative. In other words, a positive is a positive, but a negative, we never took it at face value as a true negative. So we always followed up, belt and suspenders, always followed it up with a PCR testing. And we found a small number, but a small number is still a significant number. If it's, I think it was, let's say 10 out of 400 or something like that. That's still 10 people that are infected you don't want back on the packing line.
Johnsonville, they just said that there's 46 new people in Jackson County that have positive, and 5 of them to begin with were from the Johnsonville. Have they been going strong and doing something different? It sounds like
they have
sounds like we got some serious problems going on. Right
Yeah,
now.
it's a smaller plant and a different packing methodology, and that plant has been shut down until it gets the numbers of cases are small enough to bring it back up.
Governor, do you plan to delay employer payments to capers given budget issues?
We have not made any decisions about the 2021 budget yet. We are really waiting to see what Congress does in provisions for state and local units of government. So once we know what that's going to be, then we will look at the budget and decide if and where we need to make cuts.
Governor, I understand you clarified that you would not state today whether you're going to veto any given legislation. Is it possible to say whether it's clear at this point if a veto would have a certain effect? Like, for example, if a veto would cause your executive orders to go away, are we clear on whether that is a consequence at this point?
This sort of feels like deja vu, Celia, where, we were having the same discussion in late April about what would happen to executive powers. And I have to give you the same answer I gave you then, is that we've got our legal team on this, and we'll be reviewing our options as we go forward.
Governor, speaking of legal, the Attorney General weighed in before, as a prelude to everything you've already discussed. What was your thoughts about his opinion and what he had to say in it?
Well, first I'd like everybody to remember that an Attorney General's opinion, while valuable, is just that. It is an opinion. The courts are the ones who make the rulings on whether something is constitutional or not. I think it would have been more helpful if the Attorney General could have worked with us and if he felt so moved as to make the statement that he did and to testify in front of the Judiciary Committee and give them guidance, that he would have considered the timing of all of this and the possible ramifications of the legislature moving forward as they did.
Secretary, have you been consulted on Katie Med Center's study of hydroxychloroquine as a preventative measure for healthcare workers? And can you help explain for people why the trial of the drug as a preventative measure is different than the observational study that came out today, indicating the drug is actually dangerous for people who test positive?
Yes, that's the hydroxychloroquine study is being done by the Mayo Clinic, and people who are frontline caregivers can self-identify and enroll in this. And it is exactly what you said, Lauren, and that is to see if the drug is helpful in preventing the getting infected with COVID-19. The one thing I can't comment on is if the dosage or dosage schedule is different than the treatment schedule, but this is a nationwide study, and I do know that there are significant concerns about the cardiac rhythm disturbance possibilities from hydroxychloroquine, but the study is still ongoing and hasn't been terminated because of the more recent findings.
Governor, as we move through, or as you move through looking through the bill on emergency powers, what would it have to do for you to want to veto it?
Put the people of Kansas at risk.
Secretary, to return further to the meatpacking topic, So last week on Here and Now, you said that Kansas would have the authority to shut down meat packing plants if it were needed. Has that actually been a consideration? And, you know, given just the sheer number of cases that we've discovered in meat packing plants, you know, why the determination that it's not necessary?
Yes. Good question. The statutory authorities do rest, among others, with the state health officer to do that if the county health officer isn't taking due precautions. And I don't know if any of the legal proceedings have any effect on that statute or not. That's outside of my realm. I think the reason that it hasn't been necessary to do that is because I felt that the mitigating actions taken have been sufficient. And you've seen that while there's a lot of cases, not only in the meatpacking plants, but in the communities too, and that wouldn't be surprising. I don't think there's any reason to necessarily assume that all of the COVID-19 cases in meatpacking individuals necessarily came up at the work site, because there's also COVID-19 in the community, as you would expect. But they've had very few deaths, and even some of those that have not been in meatpackers, but have been in the community members themselves. I think it's that balance that it hasn't tipped that it would be necessary to close them, given the impacts, and Governor addressed this, the personal impacts as well on the family members and the persons themselves. I think it's still safe enough, and we're getting farther and farther into this now, and that eventually the number of cases will reduce and burn out, and we're just not quite there yet.
Dr. Norman, we were tracking a difference between COVID-19 deaths from the Johns Hopkins studies and KDHE studies, 185 versus 205. A couple of weeks ago, we had a spokesperson tell us that was probably because of some lag that you're getting from the reported test. But we checked it today in the county recently, and the county numbers match the Johns Hopkins numbers, which is 205. So we're just wondering if there's kind of more of an explanation for the differentiation there.
Well, what I know is that we get not only from the county records, but we get death records. And that's the information that we have to work with. I'll have to, if there's remaining a difference with the Hopkins, I'll have to go back and find out. It wouldn't surprise me. Remember early on with the cruise ship, there was a death that Johns Hopkins assigned to Kansas. And the reason is because Kansas, when they didn't have a state to attribute it to, if it was undisclosed or unknown, it put it right in the middle of the country, which unfortunately happened to be right in the middle of the state of Kansas. We corrected that, and I'll have to go back and see. I'm just thinking out loud that if that may or may not be a recurring problem, we can get to the bottom of it. But I'm very comfortable with our numbers. There is a question that comes up every now and again. Is it the cause of death that was COVID-19, or was it the underlying conditions that were contributing factors? And usually and I've unfortunately in my lifetime has filled out a lot of death certificates, and sometimes it does require a certain judicious, was it the cause of death or was it a contributing factor? But I'm pretty comfortable. We review every one of the death certificates so that we can authenticate it. And there have been a couple that we have said are clearly not COVID-19 deaths that maybe have had it that way, but we've had to look and then go back to work with the medical examiners and the attending physicians to make sure that they're reflective. I'm pretty comfortable with the numbers.
One more question?
Governor, circling back on the AG's opinion, buried in there, if you stripped away that COVID-19 bill, there was a nugget that the Attorney General had suggested where you could go adopt there's a emergency declaration for animal pandemics. And there had been some suggestion in committee by your chief of staff that would strip everything else away. Would that be something that you could potentially go for in a hypothetical if that had been, and there is a component in that big giant bill, there is a component of that. Obviously the bill's bigger than that.
Right. You know, we've said all along that we do think that the Kansas Emergency Management Act needs review and probably modification because it wasn't designed for an emergency like this. It was designed for floods and fires and tornadoes. And so now we've learned a whole lot of things about what an emergency like this is going to create. For instance, when I declare emergencies for tornado, you're not going to see me follow up with over 30 executive orders. That just doesn't happen. This type of emergency has required action like that to protect a number of Kansans and to allow some things to happen, you know, the trucks on the road. So it is different. The statutes probably need to reflect the differences and reflect what we've learned from this, but that's not something you do in the middle of the night. You know, that is something where the legislature comes together with an interim committee, you know, and they study the issue and they carefully craft statutes or legislation to put into statute, and they hear from the public, they hear from experts, and then it's presented and debated, rather than, you know, screaming this thing through last night. It just was the wrong way to do it. So that's what I was talking about when I was talking about the timing on the AGs. Yeah, we agree. The Emergency Management Act needs to be reviewed, and hopefully we will get a chance to do that.
Thank you.
So with Trump's endorsement, you gotta run for U.S. Senate now?
I think I'm going to be VP on the 2020 ticket.
Should we expect a timeframe of a decision on a veto at any point?
Say what?
A decision on a veto, should there be next week, anytime like
We
that?
really have not gotten the bill.
Is there a time limit after we should
There's a 10-day limit from the time that it
That
hits
it's actually-
our desk, but there's no, we can't figure out the time frame when the legislature has to deliver it, so.
Because that can take days.
Right, it could be months, you know, they really don't have it. I don't think they've got a deadline to deliver it.
Was that your request to keep it at one?
Yes, because I always thought it would help you out so you could see the first
Thumbnail, you could, oh, and then you had a cutaway. Oh, let's try to, that's the only real time to do that, because I can always
Oh,
shoot
yeah.
it that way.
So what I've been doing for the long press conferences is I'll time it on my watch, and then I just do like marks.
Yeah.
Like stop it. So like I just kind of, so I can just lay it down and I just go boom, boom.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Little manual shot marking. But I do like the cutaways. You're like the only one that does it, so I appreciate that.
Not no more, now that I see how you do it.
Yeah, but see, yeah, then I always watch through the beginning parts and the cutaways, and then
Yeah.
Both times when I zoom into them, the first time I always go tight without showing that hand for some reason. So you do have one shot tight.
And sometimes I'll run around and I'll just shoot some other thing.
Yeah,
on my phone.
no, that's clever that you do that. Very clever.